Hello and welcome to another video lecture. So in this video, we'll talk about Unit 3 of the course CC205, so which is the data models. So let's proceed to the objectives of this lecture. So first, we will learn about the basics of data modeling and why they are important, why they are considered to be important, and we'll also learn about the basic data modeling blocks, so the different components that is used for data modeling. We'll also learn what are business rules and how they influence the database design. Okay, we will also learn the major data models evolved. So from the previous data models, so may different na siya na phases or evolutions. And we'll talk about the emerging alternative data models and the need they fulfill. And last is how data models can be classified by their level of abstraction. So by their level of complexity, or by their level or detail. Yes. So kung manda ang components ng interact, ano man ang properties nila, details, etc. Okay, so let's proceed to the first part, so which is the introduction. So designers, programmers, and users see data in different ways. Meaning, so may different use, different purpose na siya ang data, depende sa sa gagamit. So different use of the same data lead to designs that do not reflect the organization's operation. So kung lain-lain ang pag-view nyo, so so hindi na unified ang so wala ka mo sang universal or general way of the data structure. So with that, so data modeling reduces the complexities of the database design. So with use of data modeling, so dira na so in that way, that model can be used by designers, can be used by programmers, so as well can be processed to have output that can be used by end users. So overall though, magamit na siya or ma-utilize na siya by most of the users. So this reduces the complexities of database design. So pag-structure sang data, pag-butang sa relationships, na. So dira na siya ginabutang sa data modeling. And then various degrees of data abstraction help reconcile varying views of the same data. So may lain-lain na data sa levels of data abstraction. So meaning abstraction, so kung ang levels na gina-hide ta ang data or ang processes involving with that data models or with the entities. Okay, so let's start on defining what is data modeling and data models. So first, we'll define data modeling. So this is an iterative and progressive process of creating a specific data model for a determined problem domain. So mag-create ka na sa data model, so ang mga data nga available. So within the data, ang entities nga involved, ang relationships between entities muna. So this is an iterative, so meaning gano siya gina-update siya so samtang ginagamit o gina-utilize ng database. So over time ga-improve na siya. So iterative, so i-test niluwa tapos i-improve, tapos i-test, improve, samtang i-use kag i-improve. So unending na ang theoretically unending na ang lifespan sang data models. So we have data models. So this is a simple representation of complex real-world data structures. So simple meaning hapos siya i-interpret. So it removes the complexities of the complex details that is involved in the components or entities that are related. So this is useful for supporting a specific problem domain. So mayroon ta problem domain, mayroon ta sa businesses, mayroon ta sa research. So may line na sila nga pag-model, line na sila nga techniques or pag-structures sang data models nila. And then for the model, so this is a abstraction of a real-world object or event. So abstraction 2, this is a representation. Representation na in sense nga do basic lang ang pag-define sa model sa real-world object. So for the importance of data models, so they are a communication tool between the designers and then the developers, so as well as the end users. But gamay lang na communicate ang benefit sang end user. For communications, na siya kay si designer na go-obra sa data models. So once maobra ng data models, so i-interpret na siya ni developers in order to implement the database on their code. So on how to access the database, on how to get the information, the fetch request queries. So amo na ang gateway. So the middleman between the designer and then the developers. So this also gives an overall view of the database. So kaya sa database, so ara ng mga entities nga and then their relationships. So with the data model, so muna do ang overview or high level na view sa database. So meaning ang names ang entities, names ang components nga participate in ilang relationships with one another. Then it also organizes data for various users. So may different users and users, clients man na. So may sa line na nilang pag-organize ng data. And then this is a abstraction for the creation of a good database. So this ang munang basihan nila. This is a good start kay abstract niya ang the model. So dira na mong pisa, then as the database is being developed, so dira na ta i-specify ang details, more specific details na kinanglan para maging good ang database, mag-run ang application, so on. So it also facilitates interaction among the designer, the applications, and the programmer, and then also the end users. So data model is an abstraction siya. So meaning it cannot draw required data out of the data model. So for the data model, so wala siya makuha sa data. So meaning do representation, basic representation lang yun siya. Okay, so next. So we have here the building blocks of the data model. So here we have the entity. So this is a unique and distinct object used to collect and store data. So within that entity, so dira na ginabutang ang data. So collect and store data. Then for the attribute, so these are characteristics of an entity. So with entity, so mayroon sila specific characteristics, attributes such as these. For example, mayroon entity being a student. So may attribute ng student ID, may attribute ng student name. And then with that attribute, so may siya ang iyang value. May value na siya. Pinaman siya nga distinct object na siya. Kaya wala na siya mostly wala na sang same na entity that exists within the same within the database. So dapat isa lang na siya, unique lang na si entity. So with that, may entity kita, may attribute, then we have the relationships. Kaya multiple entities nang exist sa database ta. So gabutang ta na sa relationships between those entities. So if may relationship, so sometimes pwede na mag-ubra sa database nga wala sang relationships. Okay, so with the relationship, so this describes the association among entities. Yan may sang different types ng relationships, so one-to-many. So one entity relates to many entities. So many entities relates to many entities, and then one entity is related only to one entity. So may different types of relationships na siya. And then here we have constraints. So constraints, so these are set of rules to ensure data integrity. So mayroon na siya constraints or limitations nga gina-enforce on the entities, on the relationships para ang integrity sa data is gina-maintain na siya nga good, always good. So mag-update ka sa data, mag-update ka sa data, sa entity, sa attributes, so gamitin magyapon ng integrity sa data. Okay, so that is the basics of data models. Now, let's move on to the business rules. So what is this business rules? So these are brief, precise, and unambiguous description of a policy, procedure, or principle. Well, this can be also described as a rule. Diba? Rule or procedure, so series of steps, series of tasks that exist within a company or within a department, etc. nga gina-implement. So usually gina-implement niya siya sa database. So this enables defining the basic building blocks. So ganito define ta na sa business rules. So gina-state dira ang entities nga present, ang relationships between entities, diba, ang constraints. So ara na tanan o mostly ara na sa business rules. So before na ta mag-ubra sa data model, so usually halin na sila sa business rules. Bali, rules mo lang ginaset nga dapat amo ni i-follow sa application, amo ni i-follow sa function. Muna. Then this also describes the main and distinguishing characteristics of data. So within the business rules, so mambal nga for the for students, example may business rule beta sa university, then mambal siya for students, so it should have a unique ID, it should have a full name or last name, first name, middle initial, etc. So diran tanan exist in the business rule. So with that business rules definition, so let's go to the common sources of business rules. So we have sa companies, company managers, so gina-state nila kung ano na ang flow sa work, ang usual task ng employees, di ba? For example, may operations such as mag-time in, time out, so ano ang proper flow. So ano nang entities nga participate dira. Such as the employee, di ba? So ma-time in siya, so ma-input siya sa kung naman the operations kakatabo for timing in or timing out. Also, galing man sila sa policy makers. So may specific nga tao nga gaubragit sa policy mismo. So, policy for the company, policy for the universities, departments, so for groups or yes. Pwede ta na makuha sang business rules. Also, si department managers, di ba? Gihatag man na sila sa instructions man na, so gina-define man nila ang entities nga ga-interact with each other, ang relationships. So for example, maambal based ang department companies nga one sa isabi ka sales nga company sa BPO, so one agent can handle multiple, or one agent can handle many clients. So the agent can have these following attributes: student ID, student so the agent can have this data. Also, we can get business rules on written documentation. So these are written documentation. So ang ginsulat na siya sa company managers, sa policy makers, usually gina-write down na nila sa documents para para hindi siya madula. So then remember na siya or pabasa na sa mga newcomers, etc. And then the last source is we can get it directly from end users, so using interviews. So, ma-interview ka sa end users. So, kung ano man na ang gusto nila, 'di ba? Anong gusto nila nga flow sa atong application. Kung ano na gusto nila nga matabo within the application. For example, kung si user malagin, so na obraw niya sa user, kung mag-register gali si user, dapat may username, may password, for example. Tapos, kung ano pa ang information na kuhaon. So, muna ang sources of business rules. So, let's go to the reasons for identifying and documenting business rules. So, this helps standardize the company's view of data. So, once ma-identify ta, so ma-define na ang common flow, common functionalities. So, mas standardize na ang mas standardize na ang pag-ubra sa mga employees, diba? Sa mga, for example, sa mga software developers, so may standard na sila na rules when it comes to working. So, may standard na sila in their daily work. So, that means may standard na to they can represent it in data form. So, it also is a communications tool between users and designers. So what this means is that to designers kay sila na maubra sa data models. So in order to create those data models, sumano sila, ma-refer na sila sa business model. Diba? Kaya sa business model, so dira na ang entities, ang relationships, constraints, attributes, so dila na tanan present. So if this is a good documented or good written documentation, this enables the designers to properly retrieve the correct information. So as well kay si users, si business rules kay halin ni siya sa this can be from the users themselves, so via interviews. It also allows the database designer to understand the nature, role, scope of data, and business processes. So, ara na dira na-list sa business rules kung naman ang nature, ang present na components, scope of data, limitations, constraints, etc. So, they can, designers can develop appropriate relationships, participation rules, and constraints. Kaya ara na sila present sa business rules. So, ma-define na dira ang relationship. So, therefore, ma-translate sa designer properly into the data models. So, if good gid man ni siya ang business rules, kung klaro ni siya, and then well written, well documented, overall, makaobra ni sila sang accurate na data model. Ito muna importante. Amugin ang source sang data models is the business rules. So, translating business rules into data model concepts. So, these are some notes. So, first is the nouns are translated into entities. So, we have employees, teachers, students, managers, department heads, maybe president, dean. So, those are the nouns, the present business rules, so they can be translated into entities. So, amo na tong ang entity names. And so, we have verbs. Verbs translate into relationships among entities. So, we can say that a teacher handles many students. So nambal sa business rules nga, a part-time teacher can hold 3 classes. So, yes, can hold 3 classes or teach 3 classes. So, we can say that the relationship between the teacher and then the classes is holds or teaches. Then the relationships, so these are bidirectional. So, this can work with, for example, the teacher and the classes. So, the classes, related ni sila by the teacher, and then si teacher related ni siya to the classes. So, questions to identify the relationship type. So how many instances of B are related to one instance of A? And then how many instances of A are related to one instance of B? So muna siya pag ano. So kung how many instances of, so if ano, so we can say if teacher handles many classes, so these classes, so si B is the classes, and then si A, si teacher. So this is bidirectional na siya. So when we say this one, so how many instances of B? So one class is handled by one teacher, and then kayo ng bata kayo na one teacher holds many class. So one teacher, yan muna. So how many? Only one teacher are related to multiple instance of B. Kaya mo eh, kamutong yan ako, one teacher holds many classes. Kaya hindi man ta pwede nga ano, nga si one class is handled by many teachers. So usually ang sa business rule dira is only one teacher is handling the class. But a teacher can handle many classes. So for naming conventions, is present siya sa data models. So entity names are required to be descriptive of the object in the business environment. So, and then use terminology that is familiar to the users. And then the developers as well. Para do hapos. For the attribute names, so required to be descriptive of the data represented by the attribute. So, kung ang name sa attribute is related niya sa data. So, kung anong data dira is combination or ID sa student, so ang attribute name niya is student ID. Kung ang data dira is string, tapos ang name sa last name sa student, so ang name sa attribute is student last name. For proper naming, so this with proper naming, so this facilitates, so this gives communication between parties, so developers and then designers, so within the users and then the designers. So sakto wala na sang misunderstanding nga matabo. So kay pag-check pa lang sa data model, so automatically mabala na sa user or mabala na sa developer nga this is the teacher ni siya nga entity. And then this also promotes self-documentation. So gina-document ta sakto nga pag-document. So there so with the self-documentation, so later on, if gusto i-look back sa iba nga developers o iba nga designers ang previous nga designs, so pwede nila ma-check ni ang data model. Okay, so let's move on to the evolution of the major data models. So here, so familiar ka mo sa file systems. Then, on the second generation is the hierarchical and network. Next is the relational. So, and then the fourth is the object-oriented or object and relational. So, manotice nyo nga some of the terms nga such as the entities and attributes are do pwede siya ma-translate into object-oriented na principles. So later on, i-discuss na siya briefly kung ano siya ang object-oriented na model. So ang fifth na generation, so we have the XML hybrid, the BMS, and then last is we have the emerging models, so which is the key value store, and the column store. So this siya ang no SQL na siya or non-relational. So, mayroon sila comments of sa first sa file system. So, we have the IBM mainframes. Wala siya. It just records, manages records, not relationships. So, hierarchical. So, navigational access niya. Here, so this is the common niya. The relational. So, this has the conceptual simplicity. So, ER modeling and support for relational data modeling. And then sa object-oriented, so ang model diri is object and then relational supports, object data types, may star schema. Then here we have the XML hybrid and structured data support na siya. So, kay diri sa relational and then sa object-oriented, so do may structure na siya gina-follow. So, but for hybrid, so wala, siya, nag-start na siya nga unstructured data support. Then, support na siya sa XML. Then last is we have the key value store. So, siya, highly scalable na siya, then distributed, so high performance, for tolerance. So, very, prefer na siya over large amounts of data. So, here we'll first discuss the hierarchical network models. Okay, natapos na si file systems. So for hierarchical, so this manages large amounts of data for complex manufacturing projects. So very specific lang manufacturing projects. These are represented by an upside down tree which contains segments. So segments na siya. So hierarchy, di ba? Mayroon sa babaw, mayroon sa dalo. Ito muna. So mayroon sa child, so mayroon naman siya entities dire. So equivalent of a file system record type. So, mayroon tayo segments dire. 3 segment. So, this depicts a set of one-to-many. So, you have here 1. Mayroon siya relationship na many. So, 2. So, 2 or more is considered to be many. Yung sa network models naman, so this represents complex data relationships. So, this one, kay complex manufacturing projects lang. Si network models, kay gina-represent niya ang data relationships na. So, this improves database performance and impose a database standard. So, at that time, so this was a big leap na when it comes to database. And this can depict both one-to-many and many-to-many relationships. So, unlike a hierarchical, it can only depict one-to-many. So here we have the advantages of hierarchical model. So first is we have it promotes data sharing. So sharing between the upper entities and the lower entities. And then we have parent-child relationships. This promotes conceptual simplicity and data integrity. Diba kayo manotice na clearly defined to relationships ang parent to child. Then database security is provided and enforced by the DBMS. So si DBMS na siya provide some security. And this is inefficient with one-to-many relationships. Kaya mo malang na relationships nga gina-define niya. But the disadvantages of hierarchical model is this requires knowledge of the physical data storage characteristics. So dapat balaan mo ng physical para ma-translate mo sa sakto nga model. The navigational system requires knowledge of hierarchical path. So in order to navigate from the top path to the specific na lower path, dapat balaan mo ng pasikot-sikot. So balaan mo na ang directories, balaan mo ng path nga katuan mo. Then changes in structure require change in our application programs. So, kung mag-change yung structure to, dapat ma-update man itong application programs na ga-access sa hierarchical models. Then, implementation limitations. So, muna kayo, sa pag-implement is, ang structure yan. Then, no data definition. So, since ang relationships man na ang defined to one-to-many, then lack of standards. So let's proceed to the network model. Iyang advantages and disadvantages. For advantages, so this is simple ni siya in terms of creating the concept of the network model, and it can handle more relationships compared sa hierarchical model. So data access siya is flexible so hindi na siya by hierarchy. And data owner and member relationships promotes data integrity. Then this has standards, so may standard siya nga gina-follow. And then it includes data definition language. So pag-define sang data structure, so ang unod man sang data, the attributes, the entities. And then data manipulation language. So sa pag-update sa data, so may ara siya sang functionality. So ang disadvantage niya is we have the system complexity limits efficiency. Kay siya, sa pag-network na siya sang entities. So kung mas complex na, so ang less and less efficient isang system. The navigation system, so pag navigate from one entity to another, yields complex implementation, application development, and management. So samtang gadako ang entities na present with the model, so gamat na gaano man siya, complex man siya. Non-structural changes requires changes in all application programs. Kaya change man ang structure. So gamat man siya complex. So let's proceed on the database concepts. So this I'll continue on discussing this topic on the next video lecture. Okay, so thank you for watching and see you on the next one.